All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is the Interwar period. Now, this is the period between the First World War and the Second World War. And we're going to be talking about 5 things that you should know about as you go to learn more about this topic, because it's a complex topic and there's a lot to it. All right, first off, first thing that we should, kind of know about, and that would be Russia. All right, Russia. So, you may not know this, but the United States military invaded and fought in Russia between 1918 and 1920. We did this for a couple of reasons. First, the Russian Revolution in 1917 set off a complex series of events that would eventually result in the creation of the Soviet Union by the mid to late 1920s. The United States was not exactly supportive of the idea of a communist Russia or a Russia leaving the war, this kind of thing. But we also wanted to protect some allies, the Czechs. We wanted to protect over $1 billion in American assets, and that's a lot of money in 1918. It's a lot of money now, but it's a lot of money in 1918. So we sent a number of American soldiers, partly through to Vladivostok and elsewhere, and they're going to serve throughout parts of Russia during this time with other allied forces as well. All right, so the first thing would be Russia. Secondly, the second thing that we've got to know about, demobilization. All right, demobilization. So remember, the American military got pretty sizable by the time you get to 1918. And it was ramping up to get bigger. But once the war comes to an end, the United States military is going to decrease. It's going to go back down to a much smaller size, because you don't have a grand tradition of a very large standing army in U.S. history at that point. So part of this is the process of mobilizing individuals out of the Army, out of the Navy, right? This idea of sending folks home. Another part of this was the question of what are they going to do when they get home. So this is the era in which you're going to see the creation of something called the American Legion, which was a post-war veterans organization where veterans could find a voice in American public affairs. That voice, of course, would struggle a bit in the early 1930s. By the time you get to the Great Depression, right, many World War I veterans found the economy very difficult in the 20s and early 30s, and they took part in something called the Bonus March. Another part of this demobilization process is how American culture in the 20s thought about veterans and their service and their role in World War I. And this was the era in which a number of statues and memorials are built, the era in which you start to see different, doughboy kind of archetypal statues plot up all over, stand all over America. An example of this might be the Liberty Memorial Museum in Kansas City, which is now part of the National World War I Museum, and this opened in 1926, something like that. All right, thirdly, technology. So the interwar period is a time period in which a lot of different kinds of technologies that were introduced at the tail end of World War I get a lot more fleshed out, because the thought being you're going to need new technologies to fight more mobile kinds of war, both over land and in other battlefronts in a coming conflict. A good example of this, of course, would be the debates over air power, but also very much so the introduction of aircraft carriers. The first for the Americans was the USS Langley. This thing comes online around 1922. Now, fourth thing for us to think about would be doctrines. Again, much of the Western Front during the First World War was a very static conflict, okay? So you have your trenches, you don't have a lot of mobility and movement, and many of the technologies and new military doctrines of that tail end of that war were designed to try to stop that kind of static conflict from happening again. So much of the doctrinal debate in the 1920s and 30s is how to take these new technologies, how to use them in a mobile fashion, and how to win, a future conflict. So again, a good example would be air power. Individuals like Billy Mitchell are very famous with this in the U.S. And whether or not bombing would be a good idea, can you use it independent of ground force, that whole process. Last thing for us, the interwar army. The army for the United States military during this period gets much smaller, and there are a few reasons for this. One, of course, is that legacy of size. One is also funding, right? Late 1920s, early 30s, by the time period you get to the Great Depression, right? Not a lot of additional funding. And so you're also not going to see a lot of new weapon systems, at least in the first decade or so. So the Army becomes much smaller, less responsive, and is going to have a lot of work to do when World War II gets going. Thanks so much.